And that's the thing. I mean, he is literally calling them alchemists. Okay, let's unpack this, because looking at the Antidote by Reverend Jesse Lee Peterson, the premise he just comes out swinging with is guaranteed to shock a lot of people. Like, he's making this massive sweeping claim that the modern civil rights movement isn't just, misguided, but is fundamentally a racket.
Right, a highly profitable racket if we actually follow the architecture of his argument here.
Yeah, but I really want to look at this specific metaphor he uses because it basically frames the entire book. Medieval alchemists, the guys who tried to magically turn lead into gold. Well, the author argues that figures like Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, and even Barack Obama act like modern-day political alchemists. But instead of lead, they take these base grievances and
they transform it into fool's gold.
Exactly, into fool's gold.
Which, in the context of this text, translates to massive welfare expansions, corporate payouts, and just consolidated political power. What's really crucial to understand about the author's thesis here is that to keep this machinery running, these leaders have to artificially maintain a very specific emotional climate.
Right.
They literally require Black Americans to remain perpetually angry and white Americans to remain completely paralyzed by guilt.
Wait, slow down. Just playing devil's advocate for a second. For anyone listening, that is a wild concept to wrap your head around. Just imagine a system where the leadership fundamentally relies on its followers never actually succeeding or healing. Because if the followers heal, the leaders are suddenly out of a job. That's a massive accusation. How does the book actually back that up?
Well, the text points to the specific historical mechanics of how this racket operates in the real world. A really illustrative example provided is the 1999 conflict involving Jesse Jackson and Toyota.
Okay, I know the broad strokes of a boycott, but how does the author make the leap from holding a corporation accountable to calling it a literal shakedown?
So the book details how Jackson utilized the threat of a massive national boycott to essentially force Toyota into a $7.9 billion diversity program. But the specific mechanic the author highlights isn't the dollar amount, it's the control.
The control.
Yeah, the text claims Jackson positioned his own inner circle as the gatekeepers for those lucrative corporate contracts.
Let me make sure I understand this. He introduces a guy at a presentation who is going to, quote-unquote, monitor Toyota's progress in purchasing supplies from minority-owned businesses.
Precisely. The argument is that it wasn't about broad community uplift at all. It was about centralizing power and wealth into the hands of the alchemists. And to maintain that control, the book asserts they used pure intimidation.
Right. The text mentions Black reporters like Angela Parker and Milton Coleman. When they tried to investigate or expose financial and moral failings within Jackson's organization, the book claims Jackson's allies picketed their homes.
They threatened them, yeah.
It's just an incredibly tight grip on the narrative.
Because maintaining that narrative of endless oppression is the essential fuel for the alchemy. And the other side of that equation, the author argues, is white guilt. He actually coins the term the Starbucks syndrome.
Oh, like that Race Together campaign Starbucks CEO Howard Schultz tried, where baristas were supposed to write on coffee cups to start awkward conversations about race while handing over a latte.
Exactly that. The book views that kind of corporate behavior, along with apologies from university administrators, like the ones in Madison, Wisconsin, after controversial police incidents, as institutional groveling.
Yeah.
They apologize, they validate the grievance, and that validation simply empowers the alchemists further.
So the dynamic the author is outlining is like a toxic subscription model. The leaders validate the grievance, the corporations apologize and pay up, which only empowers the leaders further. If these figures actually went in and solved the root problems of a community, they'd lose their subscribers.
Right.
They need people to stay hooked on the outrage.
What's fascinating here is the underlying psychological transaction the book claims is taking place. The alchemists are trading these unearned benefits, the settlements, the diversity programs, the welfare, for something infinitely more valuable.
Which is?
They are essentially demanding the sacrifice of the sanctity and independence of the two-parent family.
But you can't just throw out a claim like sacrificing the family without looking at the raw data. Like, if these figures are exploiting a massive reservoir of anger, where is the author saying that anger actually comes from?
To understand the source, the text points us to a staggering demographic shift regarding the breakdown of the nuclear family. The statistic provided is that in 1950, 5 out of 6 Black children were born to married parents.
5 out of 6? That's overwhelming stability.
But by 1990, the text notes that number had plummeted to 2 out of 6.
Wow.
And the author argues this is not just a shifting cultural norm. He says it is the absolute root cause of a profound psychological trauma destroying these communities.
And the mechanism he describes for how this trauma manifests is incredibly dark. I want to spend a minute on this because it's the core of his psychology. He argues that when a father abandons the home, it creates a massive emotional vacuum.
Right, a huge void.
The mother is left holding the bag, profoundly angry and bitter. And over time, she projects that deep hatred onto her son, especially if the boy resembles the father who left.
And we really need to look at how a child processes that. The boy absorbs this continuous projection of resentment. He grows up feeling inherently unloved, constantly disparaged by the one person supposed to nurture him.
Right.
That internalizes as a feeling of being fundamentally bad, which eventually metastasizes into a deep, directionless rage.
But confronting the reality of a broken home, realizing your father didn't want you and your mother resents you, is agonizing. So instead of facing that, the book says these young men are handed a convenient, ready-made scapegoat by the alchemists.
The narrative they are handed is basically, your pain isn't because your father abandoned you or your mother is projecting her trauma. Your pain is entirely because the white man and systemic racism are keeping you down.
It's a total transference of blame.
Exactly.
Holy shit, it's literally the exact same pattern every single time. Like, looking how Peterson frames this, you can see how he builds his case. He's taking these incredibly complex, highly debated national tragedies and filtering them entirely through this single lens of fatherless trauma.
Yes, because he applies this profile to some massive cultural figures. Just look at how he diagnoses O.J. Simpson.
Right. The text points out that O.J.'s father, sweet Jimmy Simpson, abandoned the family for the gay scene in San Francisco.
And the author traces how O.J. grew up in gangs, eventually acquired all the wealth, fame, and white validation in the world, yet remained completely hollow inside.
Yeah.
The book argues he was still seething with a displaced rage that had absolutely nothing to do with racism.
And the author doesn't stop with O.J. He draws the exact same parallel with Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown. Now, for anyone listening, your immediate reaction might be to completely reject this framing.
Oh, absolutely.
It sounds like he's letting systemic issues off the hook entirely. But the book's counter to that relies heavily on looking at their family backgrounds.
According to the author's research laid out in the text, both of these young men bounced constantly between the homes of different relatives. They completely lacked a steady, disciplining, patriarchal figure.
The book notes Trayvon was kicked out by his mom shortly before his death, and Michael Brown's parents split when he was a toddler, and he ended up living with his grandmother because he couldn't get along with his parents' new boyfriends or wives.
The assertion the author makes is that both young men acted out in sudden, violent rage that was fundamentally misdirected.
Misdirected at George Zimmerman and Officer Darren Wilson.
Right. The anger that fueled those fatal encounters was, according to this text, actually the unprocessed trauma of their shattered family lives, which was weaponized by the Alchemists' narrative.
And the list just goes on. He points to the Wichita Massacre brothers, Christopher Dorner going to war with the LAPD, Omar Thornton, even the Menendez brothers. It's like a misaligned laser weapon.
That's a good way to put it.
The destructive energy is 100% real, and it is absolutely lethal. But the targeting system is completely broken. Instead of pointing at the actual source of the pain, the family trauma, the abandonment, it's pointing outward at society, at the police, at innocent bystanders.
But, you can't read a psychoanalysis this aggressive without wondering about the author's own biases. Like, how does he claim to know this psychological profile so intimately?
Because the text reveals he isn't diagnosing this from an ivory tower. He's diagnosing his own past. This is effectively his autobiography.
The book details his upbringing on a Jim Crow-era plantation near Eufaula, Alabama.
Yep.
And the contrast he paints there is vital for his argument. Well, he acknowledges the deep poverty, the outhouses, the legalized, institutional racism in the nearby towns. But he emphasizes that on the plantation itself, there was strict discipline, profound respect, and crucially, a strong grandfather figure who taught him the value of hard work.
But then he moves, first to Gary, Indiana, and later to Los Angeles. And the text really leans into the irony of this transition because in the 1960s, the economy in these cities was booming. Jobs were supposedly plentiful.
Right, but this is exactly when the welfare state was taking over the culture.
Yes, and the author explicitly notes that the iron bars suddenly appearing on windows in black neighborhoods in LA weren't there to keep white people out. They were to protect black people from other black people.
And it's in this specific environment that the author himself falls into a 20-year drift.
Mhm.
The book is very transparent about this. He fathers a child out of wedlock at 18.
Ends up on welfare.
Exactly. He spends his days partying, listening to the rhetoric of figures like Louis Farrakhan, and blaming white people for every single one of his personal failures.
Which all culminates in this terrifying road rage incident on Pico Boulevard. Traffic is sluggish, a white woman in front of him doesn't run a yellow light, and he absolutely loses his mind.
He is entirely convinced she slighted him because he was black.
Right. He gets out of his car, leans into her window, spits on her, and screams racial slurs.
It is the absolute peak of the displaced anger we've been discussing.
Hmm.
But what happened shortly after this incident is what the text describes as his Damascus Road experience.
The mirror moment.
Yes. By some impulse, he asks God to let him see what he looks like on the inside. He looks in a mirror and literally describes seeing a dark, hideous demon looking back at him.
Oh, wow.
It's a moment of profound spiritual shock.
And the realization he has in that exact moment is that his hatred has absolutely nothing to do with the white woman in traffic or his white bosses or the concept of systemic racism.
Nothing at all.
The text argues he realizes it is entirely, 100% about his mother, the father who abandoned him, and his own utter refusal to take responsibility for his life.
He recognizes that the alchemists, figures like Farrakhan, were feeding on this exact unresolved childhood hatred. They were giving him an excuse to project his pain outward instead of dealing with the brokenness inside.
I have to jump in here because the book compares this directly to Richard Pryor, which is just haunting. Pryor had the exact same mirror moment.
Who did?
He was 39, looked in the mirror, saw a demon, asked, "Are you the devil?" And the reflection literally said, "Yes, I'm you." But Pryor's reaction to seeing that same trauma, he douses himself in a 150 proof rum and sets himself on fire. That is fucking insane.
It's horrifying.
It just shows you how volatile this unresolved pain is when it's finally brought to the surface.
It perfectly illustrates the stakes the author is trying to communicate. Two men face the exact same trauma, the exact same realization. One chooses redemption and forgiveness, while the other chooses self-obliteration. It is literally life or death for the soul.
Okay, so once we understand these deeply personal psychological stakes for the author, the book zooms out. Because this isn't just a modern phenomenon he's observing. He argues this is a century-old ideological war for the soul of Black America.
Right, he traces the roots of this current crisis back to two competing philosophies from the turn of the 20th century: Booker T. Washington versus W.E.B. Du Bois.
Let's break those down because they are fundamentally opposed on a day-to-day practical level. Washington gave this famous 1895 Atlanta Compromise speech. What was his actual blueprint?
Washington's philosophy was fiercely pragmatic. He argued for a focus on individual character, learning tangible trades, and building economic self-reliance.
Build your own institutions.
Yes, prove your indisputable value to society, and do not let past grievances, even massive systemic ones, overshadow your future opportunities.
And the author points to someone like Dr. Ben Carson as the modern heir to Washington's legacy. Carson had that same intense, displaced anger as a fatherless teen. The text notes he almost stabbed a kid. But he turned to faith, conquered his temper, and built an incredible life based on personal responsibility.
On the complete opposite side of the spectrum, the text examines W.E.B. Du Bois and his concept of the talented 10th.
Right. Explain the talented 10th concept because, it sounds elitist right out of the gate.
It was inherently elitist. Du Bois believed that full civil rights and political power should be achieved through the agitation and leadership of a top 10% of highly educated elite intellectuals.
So instead of Washington's focus on manual trades and quiet economic building,
Du Bois focused on political agitation, elite intellectualism, and nursing a permanent, active sense of outrage over past injustices.
the author argues Du Bois basically gave his followers the intellectual license to be permanently angry. And to be clear, we are just mapping out the author's argument here, but he asserts that Barack Obama is the ultimate modern fulfillment of Du Bois' dangerous dream.
The text views Obama as the quintessential talented 10th elite. The argument is that Obama, functioning as an alchemist, uses the very real grievances of the lower classes to consolidate his own political power.
Right.
The author claims he constantly reminds them of white racism, specifically to keep them angry dependent, and voting for his coalition.
So what does this all mean? If we look at this ideological war the author lays out, isn't it essentially the difference between deciding to build your own house brick by brick, which is Booker T. Washington, versus spending your entire life screaming at the landlord, which is Du Bois?
That's a very apt way to synthesize the text's framing. The tragedy, in the author's view, is that screaming at the landlord became the dominant celebrated culture, while the brick-by-brick builders were marginalized, mocked, or dismissed as inauthentic.
But you can't just, diagnose a societal poison without offering a way out. We've talked about the blame, the trauma, the manipulation by these alchemists. Like, what is the actual antidote?
Well, the ultimate antidote, according to the text, is radical forgiveness.
Which sounds simple on a bumper sticker, but psychologically it's incredibly difficult.
It requires confronting the deepest pain imaginable. The author states that you must actively forgive your earthly parents, specifically the father who abandoned you and the mother who projected her anger onto you.
Wow, that's heavy.
He argues that this earthly forgiveness is an absolute, non-negotiable prerequisite to connecting with good. If your heart is full of hate for your parents, you cannot receive divine love or heal the internal void.
And from that forgiveness, the text calls for a complete rejection of blackness as a primary identity. He argues that identifying first as black rather than as an individual, a Christian, or an American is a self-imposed chain.
Exactly.
It ghettoizes your dreams and mandates this collective manufactured anger.
Furthermore, the text demands a return to a very specific biblical patriarchal order: man over woman, woman over children.
Right.
In the author's view, restoring this exact hierarchy is the only way to rebuild a protective, stable nuclear family that can actually insulate children from the lies of the alchemists.
And he tries to prove it in his own life. The book details his personal reconciliation with his own estranged son. Peterson had repeated his father's mistake. He had a kid out of wedlock, drifted away. But after his own spiritual awakening, he maintained a loving distance.
Until his son reached out.
Right, his son called him, crying, apologizing, having finally overcome his own inherited anger. It's a literal modern mirror of the biblical parable of the prodigal son.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, what the author is ultimately demanding is a massive paradigm shift. He's saying this is not a political battle. It is a spiritual one.
Right.
He fundamentally believes that political solutions will continually fail and have continually failed because you cannot legislate away a spiritual sickness. You can't pass a law to fix a broken soul.
Which is a heavy, heavy synthesis to drop on anyone listening, but it is the absolute core of the book. The argument is that the entire mainstream narrative of systemic oppression, the marches, the hashtags, the corporate diversity programs, is a carefully crafted illusion.
And its primary function is to hide the devastating realities of family breakdown and unprocessed grief. It functions as a defense mechanism on a societal scale, enabling people to avoid looking in the mirror.
Leaving us with this final, incredibly provocative question to think about. If this author is right, and the loudest voices screaming for social justice are actually just masking their own deeply unresolved childhood traumas, how much of our modern political discourse is actually just a massive society-wide trauma response disguised as activism?